Norwich Bookstore, but obviously I'm hosting this from home. And while the bookstore isn't open yet for browsing, we are there every day except Sunday. And we're happy to take your orders by phone or email or via the web. And we've got the system for pickup on the porch down pat. We also have usually a little pop-up shop on the porch, depending on the weather. So we thank you for joining us this evening, and we ask you to keep your video off and your audio mute so the speakers aren't distracted. And you'll see Michael Prowl's name in the emails, and he's doing the backroom tech stuff for us. So I recommend that you choose the speaker option because of the way Zoom is set up, and then turn on your chat option, which is on my computer, a button at the bottom of the screen. And there you'll see links to the books, and you can add your questions and comments later on in the program. So we will be recording this event to post to our website later and to share with your friends who weren't able to join us this evening. The format is pretty straightforward. I'm going to do a brief introduction of both of our authors, and then there'll be a presentation, conversation between Robin and Julie, and then we invite you to share your questions in the chat box. We're not turning anybody on, that gets too crazy. And I'll jump in and share those questions with our speakers. So, Julie Carrick Dalton grew up in Maryland and on a military base in Germany. As an adult, she moved around a lot, apparently, before settling in New England, Boston and New Hampshire, more than 20 years ago. And Julie holds a master's in literature and creative writing from Harvard Extension School. And her writing has appeared in the Boston Globe, in Business Week, Chicago Review of Books, and many other publications. And Waiting for the Night Song is her debut novel. She speaks frequently on the topic of writing fiction in the age of climate crisis. And in a blog post that I was reading when I was doing some research before we invited her, she noted, quote, "I don't need to be hit over the head with lectures or dogma. Just give me a compelling story that leaves me with something to think about. And of course, I appreciate a well-crafted sentence." Well, Waiting for the Night Song qualifies for this description. And she includes Robin MacArthur's Heartspring Mountain in her list of sci-fi favorites. Robin MacArthur lives in Vermont on the farm where she grew up. She earned her BA in Religion and Comparative Literature from Brown and an MFA from the Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her debut collection of short stories, Half Wild, won the Penn New England Award for Fiction and was a finalist for the New England Book Award and the Vermont Book Award. Her well-received debut novel, which is called Heartspring Mountain, was released 3 years ago and will probably come up in conversation this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the table over to you, Julie.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me here. I am so grateful for your invitation, and just to indie bookstores in general. They've been such a gift during the pandemic. They've really lifted up all of us authors, giving us a place to gather and connect with readers and to sell our books, but especially to debut authors like me that no one's ever heard of. You've given us a place to come together and be heard. So I am so grateful. And to everybody who's here, I appreciate your time and for showing up. And I encourage you to buy books from your indie bookstores, whether of course, I'd love it if you bought mine or if you bought Robin's, but if you buy any books, buy them from your indie stores because they have been heroes during the pandemic for all of us. So I thought I would start out tonight by reading something from the book, just a really short passage. So before I read, I should tell you Waiting for the Night Song is, it's mainly a story about secrets, a friendship, betrayal, and it's set against a changing climate in a small New England town. And it's told through the perspective of my main character, Katie Kessler, from two timelines, when Katie Kessler's 11 and when she's in her late 30s, and the chapters bounce back and forth. So I'm going to start and I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 2, which is in the 11-year-old's voice. So this is the first time the reader encounters Katie as an 11-year-old girl. The warped floorboards in the kitchen played like a piano under Katie's feet. If she maintained her rhythm and bounced from the long board in front of the sink to the short plank behind her father's chair to that narrow strip in the middle of the room, she could coax the melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star out of the moaning, creaking wood. Standing at the threshold between the kitchen and the hallway, Katie mapped her route across the kitchen, seeking out the stiff mute boards that promised silent passage to the door on the other side of the room. Thin light filtered through the muslined curtains at a familiar angle, 6:30 a.m. Katie often stole mornings while her parents slept to practice in case she ever needed to escape from something. What she would need to escape from, she did not know yet. Notice your surroundings, know your escape route, like Sherlock Holmes. With 6 leaps, she landed in front of the screen door and eased it open enough to squeeze her torso through. If she opened it 1 inch too far, the squeak would alert her parents. Outside, a frothy mist hung over the lake. She tiptoed out to the end of the rickety pier and sat, letting her feet dip into the tepid water. At first, Katie didn't notice the boat, half obscured by the fog. But as it crept closer, the small vessel broke through the gauzy curtain. A yellow rowboat, drifting alone with no captain, no passengers. She stood to see inside. Maybe someone lay on the bottom, a lost child. Maybe a murderer ready to jump out and grab her. Pressing up on her toes, she stretched as far as she dared over the water. Still, she couldn't see inside. The boat floated closer, closer, then passed by her pier on the barely noticeable current without pause. The morning sun infused the mist with a creamy, molten glow. Pressure swelled inside Katie's ribcage. A longing rippled through her muscles and clung to her bones, pulling her toward the boat as if the universe needed her to act. If she hesitated, if she went in to ask permission, it would be gone, disappeared into the clouds like a dream she would never remember. She peeled off her pajama top and shorts and looked back at the house. Her toes curled around the edge of the warped gray boards, clinging to the rules she always obeyed. She filled her chest with the misty air, pinched her nose, and jumped. So I'm going to stop there. I chose that section because that is the moment that set everything in the book into motion. All the good things that happened to Katie and all the bad things that happen when the story turns a little dark. It all comes back to that moment when Katie's standing on the pier. It's that moment she always looks back on and thinks, what if I hadn't jumped in the water that day? So I'm going to leave it there and invite Robin into the conversation. And I'm so excited to be here with Robin because when I was writing this story, it took me 13 years to write this book. It was a long slog. And when I finally had a draft together and I had gotten an agent and I was trying to sell this book, I came across Heart Spring Mountain, Robin's book, and it just hit me that this is the kind of book I wanted to write. This is the feeling I wanted in a story. And I loved her poetic language and the writing and the scenery. And so I did a little fangirling perhaps, and I stalked Robin out to a bookstore. She was presenting a book like I'm doing, except she was doing it in person. And I was in the audience and got to ask Robin some questions about her story. And it was really special for me. So to have her here tonight is a real treat. So I'm going to attempt to not fangirl Robin while we're talking, but I'm really proud to have you here tonight.
Hi, Julie. I'm so excited to be here. And this is just such a beautiful novel. I thought it was I gave myself 5 days to read it and I read it in 2 days. Absolutely intoxicating, riveting, and just so beautiful. And I have so many questions about how you pulled off such a page turner and this narrative propulsion, and yet also such a deep and powerful and emotional story. So I absolutely loved it. And I love that scene that you read. In my own writing, I love writing about adolescence, and I now have an adolescent daughter, and it is such a powerful age. And what I love that you captured in that scene and really in the whole book is this relationship to nature, that age. I know that you're a mother also, but this powerful coming of age story that is very much entwined in their sense of independence and this kind of empathic spiritual relationship with the landscape and the water and the sensuality and budding sexuality that's caught up in all of that. So I'm wondering, this isn't where I was thinking I would start, but because you read that passage, I just wonder about that age and what made you want to have the backstory be set at that age, or is that just where it started for you?
Well, the whole book started with an image of little girls in a boat picking blueberries. And the rest of the story grew out of that. And the reason is, so I have 4 kids. I have 3 girls and a boy, and they're older now. But when I was writing the book, they were younger. And we used to go out in a canoe and pick blueberries off of a lake in New Hampshire all the time. And that central image of kids in a boat picking blueberries, which is a really innocent, idyllic sounding thing in a storybook. It turns dark in my story, and I had all these what if questions. And that's the great thing about fiction, is you can take an image and change it. You can ask what if and put your characters in different situations. So and I agree with you that age, that 10, 11, 12-year-old girl age, really captures my imagination, because they're not quite a little kid, they're not a teenager yet, and they're just exploring who they think they want to be. And so I find a little bit of magic in that age.
Yeah, so much magic. And that was my next question for you, was where did this start? So now I know it started with that image, but you have woven so much into this, so many contemporary issues, obviously the environmental issues, but also racism and xenophobia and small immigration and small town New Hampshire racism. And I'm wondering, did you set out to write about all of those things? Did they weave their way into the story as it was unfolding? You've woven them together beautifully and authentically, and I'm so impressed.
So it is a lot. There's a lot of themes going on in the book, and the reason it started is when I had Katie return to the hometown as an adult. I wanted the hometown to be different because Katie's different, and she's changed over these decades since she's been gone. So I was imagining what's different if she came home to this environment. The obvious thing to me was, the climate is different, and what would have changed. So I own and operate a small farm in New Hampshire, and I was building my farm during the same years I was writing the story. So I was, out in the dirt digging and, planting things in the daytime, and at night coming home and writing and doing research about agriculture. And they all started becoming one story to me, because I'd research a fact about agriculture for my farm, and then I'd work it into the story somehow. And then I'd have come up with a story question during the day and come home to answer it. And then I'd find something that I would change on my farm. So they really are one story, the farm and the book. But one piece of information I came across was that in my growing region in New Hampshire, the growing season's been extended by 22 days in the last century. And I did throw that little tidbit in the book, and it's a real number. And that sort of shocked me, because we don't think of New Hampshire as on the front line of climate change. We don't have, walls of water, and, we're not, facing severe droughts or hurricanes the way, or we are at some hurricanes, but not the way, a lot of places are. But this slow burning, slow climate change, to me, was an opportunity to look at the slow burn of climate change on a small town. And I started seeing how it would affect everybody differently. Like, there's farmers that are losing their livelihoods, crops are failing, which displaces some migrant workers. There's a threat of a forest fire. And Katie in this story is an entomologist. She studies the mountain pine bark beetle, which is a very real beetle that's been devastating forests in California and Colorado and other places in the West and in Canada. It kills off the pine trees during a drought, and then it leaves them as kindling. And a fire comes and it just rages through. And we're seeing that in California in particular, but in a lot of places. So I transported that beetle to New Hampshire. It doesn't actually exist there yet. But what happened is, as I started looking at the way this slow burn of climate change was affecting all the different people, it became everybody's story. And I realized that even a small insular little community in the mountains of New Hampshire is connected to the rest of the world in ways we don't see. And, in my story, I draw these threads between, this little town in New Hampshire to the Caribbean. The name of the book, Waiting for the Night Song, refers to a small songbird, the Bicknell's thrush, which is endangered here in New England because its habitat is being destroyed. Its winter habitat's being destroyed in the Caribbean. And so it dies off when it goes down there in the winter, and they're coming back every year in smaller numbers. So I found that there were so many, it was the climate story that expanded into all these other areas, into racism, migration, all the climate change themes came out of that number of 22 days of a longer growing season, because I think that there's a tendency in, especially here in the United States, kind of a myopic view of thinking of climate change as a looming future event, but it's already here. Maybe I'm not feeling it today, but somebody is. And it's, a position of privilege to think that climate change isn't here yet, because it is here yet. The apocalypse is already happening for somebody else somewhere. So I wanted to bring this idea that it's already here and it's already hurting people, and it's hurting different people and different communities in different ways. That was a long answer to that question.
Yeah, no, but it's so good. It's so, and I agree wholeheartedly. What I loved that you did, so I set Heart Spring Mountain a couple of years in the past during Hurricane Irene. What I loved that you did with time is that this was set in the future, but very slightly in the future. I think with dystopic climate fiction, where it's set in some unknown future, it's easy for us to dismiss this as something that's going to happen 50 years from now or 100 years from now, and is going to be completely catastrophic and world-changing all at once, right? I think what we've witnessed this year, and what we're witnessing in Texas right now, is that this will be a slow burn. That this, I saw on Twitter the other day, the apocalypse happens in slow motion. And it is happening everywhere. My parents are farmers, so that growing season and seeing what crops are growing at different times, what crops are thriving in New England and which crops are not thriving, that's all happening already. It definitely reminded me, I wondered as I was reading it, I like hearing about your expertise as a grower, because I definitely felt that level of expertise and wondered if you had a background in science or if it was just research that enabled you to be able to write about this so authentically.
Well, no, I don't have a background in science. I spent a year as a freshman in college as a biochemistry major. And then I realized that was not going to happen. And I switched over to journalism, which I am still a journalist. So that was definitely my calling, but I do love science. And when I started my farm, I'm an accidental farmer. I never should have been a farmer. I love it. But the reason I have a farm is this tract of land near our family home was 100 acres of woods went on the market for timber and development. And we have bears and deer and moose that have just walked into our yard, and they come from those woods. And to me, it was like a devastating thing to think about these woods being torn down. So I went and walked the property, and I came home, and I have a very, very kind and generous and patient husband with a very open mind. And we bought this piece of land and developed the land that had already been cleared into a farm. So there's about 5 or 6 acres cleared. We built a barn and pastures and fields, and it's full of horses now. And so I started planting things because I had to plant things now. I had a farm, like we'd saved the land, but now I had to do something with it. So I've been learning by trial and error, mostly error. I'm admittedly not a very good farmer. So I went back to Tufts and just a certificate program, not a degree program, but I got a certificate in sustainable agriculture there. And so I learned some things, but I am learning every year, and I'm messing up terribly every year. And I'm doing a lot of research on my own and just observing things. And that's kind of how I'm learning. So don't take any great farming tips from me, but
well, because my mother is a farmer, I know every time I complain about writing, I think, oh no, so much easier than farming. I never complain about writing a novel because I know what it's like to, work with the unpredictability of weather and drought and all of those other elements.
Yeah.
I wondered, I loved what Liza said in the introduction that you had written about, which is just what fiction can do in terms of writing about climate that you can't do in journalism. Say, you're also a journalist. So I wonder how you think of those two elements of storytelling in your own life, and what you choose, why you've chosen to write a novel, and what you think it can do that the essay or the journalism can't.
I love that question. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I believe that reading a novel is basically just an enormous act of empathy, that you're giving over your view of the world to see through somebody else's eyes. And you're walking with them, you're seeing what they see and noticing what they notice. And it might not be the same thing that I would notice. So you're giving over your worldview a little bit. And that opens you up to experiencing things in a way you might not. With climate fiction or eco fiction, people call it, different eco literature, stories that engage climate change or climate science. It gives you this opportunity to be in the eye of a hurricane, or to be there when the waters recede, to be there in the future when after mass species extinction. And you have this chance to mourn species that we haven't even lost yet. And that hurts you to be there and to feel the loss of animals that you love or plants that you love, so that when you come back into your own mind and your own skin, maybe are motivated to not let them go down that road, to change the future that you read in that book, or to understand that, in most cases, the communities that feel climate change first and worst are Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, poor communities. And so a lot of times I live in a privileged life. I live outside of Boston, and we're not feeling a lot of climate change. There's some, but it's not affecting my life. But it's to get inside somebody else's skin and see that it is affecting other people, and that we all bear a certain amount of responsibility for what has happened and how we respond to it. So I think fiction, not just for climate reasons, for other issues, social justice issues, it just allows you to enter the skin of somebody else and experience the world a different way. And maybe it changes you a little bit.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I love what you said about grief as a really powerful tool in the climate movement.
Yeah.
And I know I've heard all sorts of climate activists talk about that, but fiction is such a powerful way to make people feel things, yeah, viscerally, physically, make you feel it. And then hopefully we go out into the world and act. Okay, so when I was reading, I felt like I wanted to take a master class with you in how to write a propulsive novel, because I was so blown away. Every few pages, there was a brand new mystery, and I needed to know what was happening next. And then new things were surprising me. Some of those questions were answered, and just as they were answered, the next question appeared. And so I feel like it's masterfully done, and yet very authentically done. It feels natural. And so I just wonder, how did you do this? Does this come naturally to you? Did you plot out this novel? You worked on it for 13 years. I'm a huge believer in time, and the time that it takes to write a book, and to that the longer we spend with them, probably the better they'll be. So I'm just curious what that process was like for you.
I would love to tell you I knew what I was doing, but I did not. When I wrote the book initially, it was chronological. As I mentioned earlier, it's a dual timeline narrative, and the chapters bounce back and forth between 11-year-old Katie and the adult Katie. There's nothing in between. We don't get any of her middle story. But I originally wrote the whole story. I started when she was 11. I wrote middle school. I wrote high school. I wrote her crazy 20s, and all the way up to the adult story. And there's a mystery with the 11-year-old girls, and there's a mystery in the end. And I realized everything in the middle did not matter. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't part of the story. It mattered to me because it helped me know who Katie became as an adult and how she became the person she is. But you don't need to know that. Like, nobody needs to know that but me. So I just cut that whole middle out. It was slightly painful to chop all those, tens of thousands of words out of the book. But then I was left with these two, bookends, and I couldn't just ram them up against each other. So I tore them apart, and then I stitched them back together every other chapter. And what helped me is that when Katie's an adult and goes home, she doesn't know whether to trust all of her own memories. And so by giving the reader the childhood timeline side by side with the adult timeline, it allows us to experience Katie's childhood memories as an adult in a little bit, and that she learns things about her own memories. And she understands other people's views of what happened, and they're not the same as what she necessarily thinks happened. So it's kind of an exploration of memory, and not just the facts of what happened, but our relationship to our memories of, there's people make some bad decisions. A lot of characters make some really bad decisions in this book. And I like to think that they're primarily motivated by good reasons. I think they make these decisions for things that they think make sense. I think we all believe we're the hero of every story all the time. Like every time we walk in a room, we are the hero in the room. Like the narrative in our head is we're the center of everything. So every time someone makes a decision in the book, they think it's for the right reason. And so moving back and forth between these two chapters felt like an exploration of Katie's mind, coming to terms with her memories, and reconciling that she didn't always make good choices, but what do you do next? Like, what do you do after you screw up? How do you own it? Does it change you? And that to me is more interesting than the facts of what happened. It's how we respond to things is, I think, more interesting than what we did.
Yeah, and it's not just Katie, you have multiple characters, and you see how that's affected them over time, which is what I love about the novel, that the novel can hold that large expanse of time and what happens, what the long-term consequences of our actions are, which you showed beautifully. So here's a question that I loved that you brought in towards the end of the book. Katie has spent her life resisting change. And then you introduce this other character, this young graduate student environmentalist, Piper, who is saying, actually, and I'm paraphrasing for Piper, maybe I'm doing it inaccurately, but that, you know, what we don't need to do right now is resist. We need to think about adaptation and how humans are going to adapt to changing climate, how species are going to adapt. And as someone who struggles with a lot of climate anxiety and climate grief and fear for my children's future, shifting from that state of the paralysis that comes with, oh my God, we are headed towards something catastrophic, to actually, we are all just going to have to make radical changes in how we live along with the species around us. So I'm curious, did you know that that was going to be a theme in the novel, or is that a reflection of your own thinking, or I wonder what that meant for you.
Yeah, the answer to what the right thing is, I don't know. It's really like a conversation going on in my head. And for those of you who haven't read it, so Katie wants to get, there's the beetle that's causing, you know, the trees to die, setting the stage for a potential fire. She wants to get ahead of the fire by thinning the trees that the beetles are infesting to stop the beetles from killing the trees. And then Piper, who's this younger, you know, pink hair, kind of like just excited kind of person, wants Katie to understand that maybe it all needs to burn. You know, maybe it's better to let it burn and let nature take over instead of fighting it. And so there's this like push and pull between the two of their scientific minds about, you know, their responsibility to the communities around them that could be threatened by fire, or our responsibility to the nature with a capital N, you know, to, you know, and so they go back and forth. And I did a lot of snooping in Twitter circles of entomologists while I was writing this book. And I would just like eavesdrop on all the little Twitter chats between all the bug people. And there was, you know, conversations like this going on. And the storyline about Katie not being allowed access on federal land to do her environmental research, that was something I picked up by eavesdropping on entomology Twitter, that there are places where there's, you know, in the past 4 years, there's been land that's cut off, and there's been environmental projects that have been going on for decades, but we're having a gap in the research because people weren't allowed on the land. So these projects that have been going on for decades, they will resume, but they might have a couple years gap that's going to affect the project forever. So that idea got in my head. So I have Katie is a bit, she called herself a rogue entomologist because she has to decide whether she's going to trespass on federal land to prove something that she knows is scientifically accurate. But so these science questions I don't have answers to. They're like meant to be a dialogue because I don't know what the answer is. And if you know, please tell me.
Yeah, no, I don't know. And I don't think anyone knows.
Yeah.
But I love that you did bring those two elements of that conversation into the piece. And that creates a lot of spaciousness for hope, you know, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
When we're writing pieces about climate change, the question becomes, how do you shake people up? How do you make them feel that grief, that fear, that love for the natural world, and also not shut people down into a place of hopelessness? And I think that you very eloquently did kind of create these without it being overly sentimental or feeling unrealistic, opened this little doorway for how we're going to move forward into the future, or a possibility for moving.
And I think that also bringing Sal's voice. Sal is a young 13-year-old girl. When Katie's an adult, she's her friend's daughter. She also brings this fresh voice into the conversation of social justice and doing the right thing. Because one of the things in the book that I think that all my characters wrestle with is sometimes doing the right thing isn't the right thing to do. There are times when doing technically the right thing hurts people or causes damage. And so the characters are constantly having to evaluate what is the right thing to do. And Sal is very clear-minded of what she thinks is the right thing to do. She will get suspended to make a point. There's no gray areas. And so I loved her character for that reason, because she kind of is willing to say things that Katie and even Piper won't necessarily go that far, because she's 13. She can just stand up on a desk and shout and get away with it. So I think that there's a lot of room for different types of voices in these social justice conversations. And I also want to remind folks, if you have any questions and you want to put them in the chat box, we would love to hear questions about anything from my farm to my writing process, about my book, about Robin's book, which we haven't talked about much, but it's set in a similar landscape as mine. So we both share that love of land. So please throw some questions in there if you have any.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing. Put your questions in the chat. And I just have one more question for you, Julie, while we're waiting for other people to chime in. But you said you have another book. I was going to ask what you were working on, but it sounds like you have finished another book.
Yeah.
I want to hear about it.
Yeah, so the story of how this happened is funny and slightly embarrassing, but it took 13 years to write this first book because I didn't know what I was doing. And I started taking some writing classes at Grub Street in Boston, and I did a novel incubator program there, which taught me how to write a book and taught me what a plot was. I think the book didn't have a plot for a very long time. It had a lot of scenes and a lot of people doing things, but not necessarily a plot. So I learned a lot. Then I got an literary agent, and she took it out on submission to sell it. And I started getting rejections. And it took a year to find the right editor to buy this book, which was totally worth it, because I landed at a great publishing house and I'm really happy. But that year was so hard. It was very excruciating. My poor family. It was really hard. So I took all that angst and wrote another book, and I wrote it in a period of months, which after 13 years to write one book, and it was a messy, which I'm sure you know, the first draft is a mess, but it was a thing. It was an entity that existed that I could work off of. And so by the time we found that perfect editor, my agent knew about this new book. And so after they had arranged a deal for the first book, my agent slipped in there with, well, she's got this other book, and they pitched it on like 2 sentences or a paragraph, and they bought both books. So then I just turned it in about 3 weeks ago to my editor, and it's going to come out in February of 2022. It's called The Last Beekeeper. And it's not related to this book in any way, but it has similar themes. It's based on a central relationship. Waiting for the Night Song, the central relationship is between Katie and Daniella. They have this like very fierce, strong female friendship. And in The Last Beekeeper, the central relationship is a young girl and her father. And speaking of 11-year-old girls, she's 11. There's something about those 11-year-old girls. I can't not write them. So it's about set in the near future. And I introduce an event that I'm not going to tell you about that hastens the collapse of the pollinators in a way that we all talk about the future of like, oh, save the bees are dying. But I introduce a situation that they just go over the cliff, and it sends the world into agricultural and economic chaos. And it's about the relationship of a young woman and her father, who was famously known as the last beekeeper. And it's about what happens after the bees die. Mm-hmm. So you can look for that in February of 2022. I'm really excited. We're in the middle of, all the editing of that right now. So
yeah. Oh, that is so exciting. I'm so happy for you that worked out. The timing of that worked out,
Yeah.
The novel that took 13 years followed by the one that just flowed out effortlessly.
Yeah, effortlessly.
I'm sure
it was a product of anxiety is what it was. I was so tense about getting all these other rejections for the first book that I channeled it right into a new book.
Yes, that's amazing. And that sounds like a powerful story and also a frightening story. You know, I think about pollinators and bees all the time, you know, our local farms, just what is going to happen?
And I don't have any right now, and I don't have any active hives, but I have kept bees. My bees died, which I've lost several colonies over the years from colony collapse disorder. And so that was one of the motivating things about writing it. And I love writing about bees, just about the smell of them, the sounds they make, and like the vibrations of being near them. So there's a lot of the sensory detail that's in Waiting for the Night Song really comes from the lake and the trees and the granite in New Hampshire. And I think that it's a similar type writing, but it's about bees and honey and the smell and the humidity of the air in a hive and things like that. So it'll hopefully appeal to the same people who like this book.
Yeah. I do. I loved the sensory details so much, and that sense that the granite is in the lake, but has also entered their bodies and formed who they are.
Yeah.
I love, you know, I keep thinking of this Barry Lopez quote, "We are shaped by the landscapes that I'm misquoting it because I don't have it written down, but we're shaped by the landscapes that we are surrounded by at an early age." And your book seems like such a perfect expression of that, the ways that the geography and the geology and the plant life and the flora and fauna have all shaped these characters so deeply.
Yeah, and as kids, you know, they swim in the lake and they swallow lake water and they, you know, they cut themselves, they bleed in the lake. And I feel like there's this flow of the lake and the people in and out of each other in some ways. And so that the actual minerals in the lake built Katie and the trees. And there's a scene in the first chapter when she's an adult and she's climbing this mountain and she's hunting these beetles and she's sitting at the top of the mountain and she picks up a rock and she licks it. And she licks it because she knows that when you get a granite rock wet, it changes the colors and it like opens the light inside the rock and you can see the different colors and like metallic flecks and different veins in it when they're wet than when they're dry. And I've had so many people ask me, so do you really go around licking rocks? And I don't, for the record, go around licking rocks, but I do. That idea of this give and take between the land and the people is something that I think kind of defines Katie.
Yes. There is a question in the chat. I recently read a quote from Gary Snyder on Twitter. "The first step, I think, is to make us love the world rather than to make us fear for the end of the world. Make us love the world and then begin to take better care of it." Any thoughts on this as it applies to climate novels?
That's a great question. I think that, you know, with my book, with both of the books, they have some scary elements, you know, if you want to think too deeply about the future, but they are ultimately hopeful stories. They both have a hope because I think that this question kind of nails it, that you need to love the world. You can't mourn something you don't love, and you don't want to fight to save something if you don't love it. So I think that this idea of making us love something enough to fight for it is, and to have hope. We can't have hope for something if we don't think there's a shot at saving it. And so I don't ever want my fiction to be read as doom and gloom, because I don't think it is at all. There's definitely scary elements, but it's not, you know, it's coming, I hope, and from my heart, it's coming from a position of there's still hope. So what can we do?
Yeah, and how can we feel it? I always think of Mary Oliver's quote, "Attention is the beginning of devotion," which is another way of saying what Gary Snyder said, which is what we pay attention to, we will care about and we will fight for. And, you know, I know when I was working on my book and just thinking, having such an existential crisis about climate change and being a mother to young children and thinking, should I be working on this book when I could be on the streets, or I could be laying my body down on the tracks in front of coal trains, or what is the right thing to do? And I've really come to think, I don't believe that any one book is going to change the world. I don't think anyone's going to read my book and go out and radically change how they see the world or how they act. But I do think that we collectively shift consciousness as writers and as artists of all kinds. And so every single book that looks outward, that acknowledges the animate world around us, that has a multi-species perspective, that acknowledges how we are in relationship and reciprocity with the natural world, helps shift that awareness.
Yeah, and I think that there's so much wonder in the childhood view of the world, especially. I feel like there's a part of when I was writing it is I wanted adult Katie to come back to the wonder that young Katie had. And I think that's, part of hope is, like seeing the wonder and the awe in nature that sometimes we overlook as adults, maybe, when you walk in the woods to see it. And I think that there's almost a meditative quality of being in nature that, that literature can lead you to. So I think that there's some beautiful writing out there that, I think that there's more coming out, and, with climate fiction or eco-fiction, I think that it's spanning so many genres now. I mean, there's, a lot of literary fiction. You could look at like Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones about Hurricane Katrina. And then there's dystopian apocalyptic stories. And there's a romance novel that came out in January called Shipped. It's about this like enemies to lovers story on a cruise to the Galapagos. And it really engages these, responsibility and, the ethics of what we're doing with this planet. So it's like, I in the YA literature, it's coming out in so many different ways. So it isn't just one type of story. And there's a lot of thrillers, a lot of climate thrillers out there.
Yeah.
But
it does feel like we are at a turning point culturally, and I see that across, as you're saying, all across genres in our literary world as well, of just acknowledgement that we can't not write about this anymore. This is the air we are all breathing. This is what it is to be human right now, and we just have to address it in our work if we're going to be reflecting this world as it is.
And I don't know if you've read American War by Omar El-Akkad. It's a great story. It's set in the maybe 75 years in the future, and there's a second civil war brought on by fights over fossil fuels. But when he talks about climate fiction and climate narratives quite often, and he one time said something to the effect of, at some point, aren't all stories going to be climate stories? Because how are we going to be able to write about our world without acknowledging it, even indirectly? And it would kind of made me think that it's infusing itself in so many conversations, but it needs to come from a place of appreciation and love and awe to move us, I guess.
All right. Are there other questions? Liza is back to facilitate.
Yes. Sorry about that. I have no idea what happened. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the question. But are there other questions? Well, I had a question, but it sounds like you may have actually touched on that. And that was, Julie, when you're writing, do you try and read a lot of climate-oriented fiction, or do you try and stay away from it other than doing your research? Like what kind of reading do you do for your own personal enjoyment? And I'm going to ask the same question of Robin.
I do. I'm very drawn to stories that fall into that eco-fiction category. I'd say one of my very favorite reads this past year was Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey, which is isn't that just a breathtaking book?
Yes.
And she has a new book coming out this summer, so I'm dying to get my hands on it. We're from the same. She's a Macmillan author too, so I'm like thinking if I see if I got a really early copy of Migrations from my publisher. I'm going to see if I can get my hands on an early copy of this one. But it's a story set in the near future that almost all animal species are extinct, like birds, land mammals, fish, and it's a really bleak scene, but it's a hopeful, beautiful story, and the writing is stunning. And kind of in another direction, I really loved A Mexican Gothic, which is just this creepy, horror, but not too far into the horror genre, that engages like the fungi world. And, it's a great read. I loved that book. So I do read a lot in that category, but, I read pretty widely. A couple other books I loved this year that had nothing to do with climate stories were, I don't know if you've read Remembrance by Rita Woods, which came out in the spring. It's a beautiful story. And what are some other I'll let Robin jump in. I could talk all day about all my favorite books. I could just like have a whole nother hour. I won't do that to you though.
And Robin, what about you?
I don't tend to read anything dystopic or apocalyptic when it comes to climate fiction, because it's so easy for my mind to go there and to spiral into anxiety. Although Migrations was so beautifully done, and though it was set in a dystopic, apocalyptic future, there was a lot of hope and a lot of love and so much beauty. Just the language was gorgeous. So I can't wait for her next book. I really love, I'm just thinking of what favorite books I read this year. I love Max Porter, who's an English writer, his book Lanny, which is, and also Ali Smith's Seasonal Quartet, which are both books which are looking at our contemporary world, our contemporary politics, but told with all of this kind of magic realism and just surrealism, which my state of mind needed. I needed to return to a place of magic and mystery and joy amidst the kind of horrors of the past 4 years. Yeah. And both of those books did that beautifully. I also loved McKenna Goodman's The Shame, was one of my favorite books that I read this year, which she's another local Vermont author, and just motherhood, capitalism, social media, loved it.
Well, and I'll tell you two books that, one that just came out a couple of weeks ago and one that's coming out on March 2nd that have nothing to do with climate, but I cannot in good conscience not tell you guys about these two books. So The Lost Apothecary, actually it's kind of behind my shoulder, the purple book on the shelf, The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner, is this 1800s apothecary who brews up potions to give to women to off the men in their lives who are harming them. So she's basically a benevolent serial killer. It's a beautiful book. I mean, it's getting a ton of attention and has nothing to do with climate fiction, but it really just like, it's this powerful feminist story and it's beautifully told and it's really original. And then the other one is The Kindest Lie by Nancy Johnson, which just came out and it's just crushing it. It's such a good book. It's a story of race and class. It starts at the beginning of the Obama era. And it's kind of about it. A Black woman engineer returning to her small factory town and befriending a poor white boy, and all these clashes that it creates across race and class lines. And it's so good. I'm just waiting for the movie. I'm like ready for the movie. It's such a good book. So you need to check those books out.
Speaking of movies, do you have some kind of film agent?
I do, yeah. We're shopping it around as we speak. So yeah, I'm not holding my breath, but we're actively sending it to some people that, gives me goosebumps thinking about them reading the book. So we'll see.
Yes, it just seems like such a perfect cinematic book to bring to film. So I'm rooting for it wholeheartedly.
Thank you. And I'm really excited about engaging with book clubs with this book too, because I feel like there's so much to unpack. We've talked a lot about the themes of, of racism and immigration and climate change, but that's one of the things I've really enjoyed is I've connected with people and I've been zooming into book clubs and really unpacking some of these questions. And it's been, it's exciting to me because sometimes I've found that book clubs find things in my book that I didn't know about, which has been pretty fun.
Interesting. So somebody's asked who you would want to play Katie in the movie.
Oh, I definitely have someone in mind for Katie. I don't know if I should say that, but I'm going to say it anyway. Amy Adams. Amy Adams is Katie.
Interesting.
As I was writing the book, I always envisioned her, and there's a couple scenes in particular, the opening scene where she's on the scene where she licks the rock, the one where she's climbing the mountain, and the scene and chasing down these beetles. In my mind, while I was writing that scene, I was writing Amy Adams climbing that mountain. So that would be the dream. Interesting. Good to have dreams.
So a question that I had, you talk about Katie and her relationships. We've talked a lot about the climate and the situations, but the relationships within the book are quite wonderful. And I'm wondering, in the course of over 13 years, how the characters evolved.
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the characters of Katie and Daniella are very, very much based on a friendship I had as a child. And am Kate. I'm the Katie in the relationship. And I had a friend who was like the Daniella to my Katie. And she was a little older, a little prettier, a little cooler. And she let me be ridiculous, which was such a great friendship. I used to write a lot of stories as a kid. I would write fan fiction for the Mork and Mindy TV show and the Wonder Woman TV show and Charlie's Angels. And I would write these fan fiction scripts and we would act them out. I actually still have some cassette tapes of these ridiculous stories I wrote, but we would act them out. And she let me be ridiculous. She let me have this imagination and do all these things and didn't ever make me feel judged or silly, where she was definitely a much cooler girl than I was. And that was kind of the dynamic I was setting up with Katie and Daniella when they were little, is that, Katie just had all these quirky, weird, ideas about the world, and Daniella embraced them and let her be who she needed to be. And they had a level of trust. And I think that there's certain formative relationships in your life that kind of create who you are a little bit, even if they're fleeting. And my relationship with this friend of mine, we, just for the record, never covered up any crimes or did anything illegal. It was just based on our friendship. It was not a true story. But we, grew apart, and I never saw her again after high school. But my memories of her are enormous. And I think that there are certain times in your life that the memories take up more space in your mind, and that they kind of like own more real estate in your brain than other parts of your life. And for me, that friendship is enormous. I can remember so many details of things we did those few years. We ran wild in the woods all summer. So I wanted to know what happened to her, and I looked her up and I found her, and we've reconnected since I wrote the book, which has been kind of this added bonus to this story. And in my book, I wrote Daniella as in the healthcare field, and my friend grew up to be a nurse, which when I found all that out, it felt really good. So those relationships, there is truth in them. They're not meant to be specific individuals, but there's a lot of truth in the relationships.
Yeah, they resonated for me.
Thank you.
That was good. So are there any other questions? Robin, do you have any final questions or thoughts?
Oh, I just wanted to add to that. Those relationships felt very authentic to me as well. And my own thinking about writing is none of my characters are autobiographical or based on actual people I know, but the emotions are authentic and the relationships are rooted in authentic relationships and emotions around those relationships. And so to me, I think that is the secret to writing compelling, believable characters is, there has to be that level of realness and truth underneath all of the disguises that we can have the pleasure of imagining and using as writers.
And I have one thing that we could close out on. This is not from the book, but it's from my acknowledgements. It's the last couple lines of my acknowledgements, because there's a boy in the story that Katie and Daniella, when they're little girls, refer to as the summer kid, because he's this mysterious boy that sits on a pier, and they paddle by him in their boat when they're going to pick blueberries, and they can't imagine, like, who is this kid? Why is he so weird? What is he doing? And he's a real kid. Like, I would go blueberry picking all the time, and I still go blueberry picking all the time on the lake. And this boy would sit on his pier, and I'd paddle by him. And every year, he's a year older, he'd sit there, he's reading books, plucking on a guitar, fishing alone. And I imagined this whole world for him. And he is one of the three main characters in this story, but I have no idea who he is. I've never talked to him. So I'm just going to read the last few lines of my acknowledgements. And I think that might be a nice place to end, on a nice, dreamy little note. And lastly, to the real life summer kid, the boy who sat alone on the end of his pier reading, fishing, and daydreaming. I have no idea who you are or what your name is, but as I paddled by your pier, summer after summer, you inspired a story in my mind that took on a life of its own. I hope your world is rich and full of the adventure I imagined you to be dreaming of. That feels like a good place to end.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Well, I have a fascinating conversation. Recommend all the books, and I'm glad everyone could join us tonight, and I hope you can join us for another event. We've got a bunch of things scheduled into the future. The Vermont Almanac, we've got a woman zooming in from Ireland in March for her book, Nora, which is a fictionalized life of the woman who spent her life with James Joyce, and lots of other things in the works. So sign up for our newsletter so you don't miss anything. And we appreciate your support of the Norwich Bookstore. And Robin and Julie, I need you both to keep me posted on your next endeavors. So hopefully we can meet in person, and if not, we can Zoom again. So thank you both so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Robin. This was a lot of fun. And thanks to everybody who came. Don't forget to support your local indie bookstores.
Thank you. Thank you.